it seems just obvious, but the piece you wrote, or whomever wrote it for you guys, was pointing out the fact that, I mean, this is the story. It's not like a little subplot. And the media just this whole time kept the framing that, nah, this is just differences in ideology, progressives versus moderate. Can you kind of talk about, to me, A, why that's so damaging, but B, uh, I really wish, if the media wasn't going to report on it, progressives doing these nonstop rounds of interviews, Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna, Bernie Sanders, they would have mentioned it. But unfortunately, it seemed they tried to play kind of the diplomatic game rather than just going kind of on offense in that manner.
Talking about money in corporate media and in Washington is seen as taboo. It's something that's seen as impolite. You're breaking etiquette rules, and so what you end up having is a conversation about a bill where corporate lobbyists, armies of corporate lobbyists, are trying to influence the bill, where those lobbyists have specific power and influence with legislators based on how much their industries are funneling in terms of campaign cash to those legislators. And that determinative influence peddling and corruption is written out of the story, which means that the story you're hearing about this bill is not really the story of what's actually going on. It's a fairy tale. It's not a real representation of what's actually driving the bill. And that's because corporate media doesn't want to talk about it because its sponsors don't want to talk about it. Politicians who are being bankrolled by these industries obviously don't want to talk about this. It's embarrassing for them. They don't want to look like they're so nakedly corrupt. And so the American public is being told a story about the legislative debate and negotiations over this bill without being given the information about what's actually driving the debate. I mean, here's the thing. Kyrsten Sinema has been bankrolled with more than $1.2 million worth of ads from a pharmaceutical industry dark money group run in part by pharmaceutical lobbyists, at the same time that she has been trying to water down or kill Democrats' drug pricing measure, the promised drug pricing measure. The idea that that money and that support for her is just suddenly coming to her aid with no connection to her behavior on Capitol Hill is preposterous. It is the story, but it's not. It's barely part of the story that we've heard in the larger telling of what's going on in this bill. Same thing for Joe Manchin and the fossil fuel industry. And look, I want to be clear. I don't think that there are pharmaceutical industry or fossil fuel industry sponsors calling, the New York Times or calling CNN or calling ABC News and saying, you can't report on the money that we're giving to these politicians. I think it's much more subtle. And as we put it, it's not explicit quid pro quo corruption. It's so pervasive,
Right.
it's so immersive that it's actually at the level of culture. This is corporate media culture. To not talk about the topics and the facts that everybody inside corporate media knows would potentially offend sponsors. And let's be very clear. Every time when you turn on your television, you're getting some sort of pharmaceutical or fossil fuel related advertisement. These industries are spending billions and billions of dollars a year on advertising, and that has a dual effect. It has the first effect to sell their products, obviously, but it has a secondary effect to be constantly letting media outlets, corporate media outlets, know who butters their bread. And the result of that is a corporate media conversation in which money is written out of the story.
And, to me, and, obviously there's a whole cottage industry of just bashing Bernie and the squad and all that. And frankly, I think they played this wrong. I really do. I don't ascribe negative motives to them, but after actually holding the line, which I credited them for, kind of predictably kind of just folded at the end. But one thing that I think, and I'd love to know your insight because you've been on the other side. I mean, you've worked on Capitol Hill. You were in Bernie's campaign. I tell the audience all the time, and this isn't to blow smoke up your ass, but people don't remember. Towards the end of Bernie's campaign in 2020, he started closing the gap among older voters that had been his kryptonite. And why? Because David Sirota and the campaign were going on an all-out assault on Joe Biden over trying to privatize Social Security. The ads, on social media, but the campaign was directly going after Biden over Social Security. And I remember being stunned. Oh, wow, Biden's starting to lose a little support among older voters. That's because you were going on offense and pointing out the record. But for some reason, I mean, this is not specifically only about AOC, but I saw her on a CBS Sunday morning interview, and it was like she was twisting herself into a pretzel to not say anything direct about the money they were taking, about the corruption, to make it seem like, oh yeah, we just kind of, we're a big family and we come from different ideas. So to me, if the progressives are not going to go on the offense about open corruption, which I do think is a popular message, I think people are against corruption. Then how are you supposed to change the ultimate framing of these debates and actually activate the not just the progressive base, but people in West Virginia, people in Arizona? If Ro Khanna on CNN constantly, if Pramila Jayapal on CNN, it's like, I don't know. It seems like they kind of won't get away from this diplomacy strategy and inside baseball negotiation strategy, rather than just calling it what it is, that Joe Manchin is basically trying to block life or death climate policy because he's making millions of dollars to keep coal going. Or Kirsten Sinema, I mean, I didn't hear any of them in interviews mentioning she's in Paris fundraising right now, blocking this. I'd love to know your thoughts. You can't get in their head, but it seems to me to be an obvious strategy. You don't have to say they are corrupt. You could just point out the money they're taking, but none of them, it seems they've made a collective decision as a progressive caucus or squad to really not go there.
Yeah, and I think it falls under the rubric of not wanting to. This is a phrase you hear a lot in political circles: not wanting to impugn the motives of your opponents. And I think it's fundamentally wrong, because I think obviously, look, campaign contribution records are public records. They're public so that the public can understand who is buying and selling legislators and votes. And so not talking about that may be polite. It may be, preserve some form of comedy and etiquette in Washington, but it strips out the reality of what's actually going on. And I don't think it's a personal attack to point out that Kirsten Sinema is getting a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry while she's doing the pharmaceutical industry's bidding. It's not a personal attack on Joe Manchin hauling in large amounts of money from the fossil fuel industry while doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. It is not. It's not a personal or really negative attack. It's not an attack, frankly, to point out those facts. They are not attacks. They are facts. And if somebody perceives them to be an attack or negative, what they're saying is these are facts that should actually make us think differently about these politicians. And I would add that, look, I think everybody has a role to play. The Progressive Caucus leaders in Congress, they have to negotiate with other members of Congress. So I guess there's an argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but there's an argument out there that they have to keep it nice, let's say, and not really go for the jugular. And if you buy that argument, then the question becomes, well, where's the cavalry? Where are the liberal groups in Washington? Where are the unions? Where are the environmental groups? Where are there's a huge industry of liberal advocacy groups, well-funded liberal advocacy groups in Washington that could be playing an outside role. For instance, funding ads against Kirsten Sinema, pointing out how much money she's taken from pharma, or pointing out in West Virginia how Joe Manchin's effort to potentially a means test or put work requirements on benefits to people, how that would hurt people. That really hasn't happened. It really hasn't. And so I think we need to understand that the corruption and the complicity in Washington is not just necessarily at times among folks, legislators on Capitol Hill, but it is a larger culture, an omerta. Omerta meaning a code of silence about what can and cannot be talked about. And
Right.
again, going back to just blatant, obvious, in your face corruption, it is largely not talked about because of that omerta. An omerta that's in the Democratic Party, its coalition, its liberal advocacy groups, and in the corporate media. It is the thing that cannot be talked about, even though it is driving what politics is. I mean, I've said it before, I'll say it again. 99% of politics is basically the buying and selling of policy to benefit this or that private industry. And yet, only about 1% of the discourse, the conversation, the media coverage is actually about that 99%.